In an operating room in Los Angeles, California, an optic surgeon stood over his patient, a 9-year-old girl. He lifted his pair of specialized forceps, which are kind of like tweezers, and he opened up the 2 blades, sliding them carefully into either corner of her eye socket. Then he gently grabbed on to her eyeball with these forceps, and slowly he pulled her eyeball out of its socket until he heard the pop of air and the squish of soft tissue, which told him the eye was now fully dislodged from the socket. Now only the thick optic nerve still attached the eyeball to the girl's skull. The surgeon turned the eye over until he was looking at the back of it, and there he saw a hard, black mass on the inner part of the eyeball. He touched the mass gently. It was so thick that for a moment, the doctor wasn't sure how he was going to remove it. He needed to use enough force to get it off his patient's eye, but it would be very easy to overdo it and cause serious damage. So he had to proceed with extreme caution. With an even smaller set of forceps, the surgeon pinched the black mass and slowly began to tease it off the little girl's eye. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape: our own bodies. If you like today's story, please tell the follow button you'll teach them how to play golf, and immediately after their first tee, call the marshal and complain they are playing too slowly. This episode is called Jade's Eye. In March of 2013, 9-year-old Jade Howe sat in the nurse's office at her elementary school in Kona, Hawaii. It was the annual vision screening at her school, and Jade was busy telling the visiting optometrist all about the cupcake her mom packed her for lunch and how excited she was for hula dancing class after school. The optometrist laughed and asked Jade to sit up straight so he could examine her. Jade straightened her back and smiled as the optometrist dimmed the lights and then shined a flashlight into her left eye. Right away, Jade flinched. The light made her head hurt a little, but then her eyes adjusted. She was used to eye exams. She had worn glasses for most of her life, so she knew what to expect. Normally, she would just read charts on the wall while the optometrist gave her different lenses to try. But today was different. She'd had a headache off and on all morning, and her vision felt blurred, like everything was fuzzy around the edges. So it was harder than usual for her to read all those charts. The optometrist clicked his tongue a few times like he was thinking through a problem, and Jade got the feeling that something might be wrong. Just as Jade was about to ask if everything was okay, the optometrist handed her a black plastic spatula and told her to use it to cover up her right eye. Then the doctor held up a sheet of paper with rows of letters on it and asked her to read the lines aloud using just her left eye. But when Jade put that spatula over her right eye, her vision from her left eye became so blurred that she could barely see anything at all. She lowered the spatula and inspected it as if the spatula was to blame. But when she saw no issue with the spatula, she just put it right back over her right eye, but again, she could barely see out of her left eye. She asked the optometrist what happened to her left eye, but the optometrist just scribbled on a pink notepad and ripped off the paper, and he handed it to Jade and told her to give it to her parents the moment she got home from school. That afternoon, when school let out, Jade ran to her mother, Ho Ola'i Berman, who was standing on the sidewalk waiting for her. Jade immediately handed her mother the optometrist's report and watched a worried look come over her face as she read it. Jade asked her mom if something was wrong with her eyes, but her mom just smiled and told her not to worry. They'd schedule an appointment with the optometrist when they got home. Jade very likely just needed new glasses. Jade felt very relieved and just nodded, and then she shifted her focus and just began digging through her backpack for her lunchbox. She had saved a fruit roll-up for the walk home. Usually, Jade and her mother would stop at a park near their house to play and unwind after school, but today, when they got to that park, Jade didn't really feel like playing. She still had a headache and she could barely see out of her left eye, so she ended up just sitting in the sandbox eating her snack. Jade was absent-mindedly digging in the sand when a dog wandered over to say hello. She had seen this dog before. It was a stray, and it was a little scraggly looking, but it was always friendly, and Jade knew it loved belly rubs. And so after a few minutes of playing, the dog wandered off to a garbage can to look for food. and then Jade's mom came over and sat down beside Jade and asked her how she was feeling. Jade didn't answer. She just leaned over and put her aching head in her mother's lap. She was relieved when she heard her mom say that it was time to go home. A few days later, Jade's mother, Ho'ola'i, sat in the corner of an optometrist's office watching him finish up Jade's eye exam. The optometrist switched off the lights and smiled at Jade, and then said he'd actually like to take some x-rays. Jade's mom was a little surprised, but agreed to any extra cost if it helped her daughter see. The optometrist took the x-rays right there in his office, and 15 minutes later, they all gathered around his computer screen, looking at the enlarged images of Jade's left eye. To Jade and her mother, the image they were looking at just kind of looked like a big grape with veins running through it. But the optometrist immediately pointed at a small black mass located on the retina at the back of Jade's left eye. He was certain that this black mass was causing Jade's vision loss. The retina's job is to focus the eye, and so the mass was clearly getting in the way. But he wasn't sure what the mass was. The best thing to do was treat it like an infection and start Jade on antibiotics. Then they could see if that cleared it up and go from there. On the car ride home, Jade complained that her headache was back. Her mom sighed and said that it sounded like something only ice cream could fix. Jade smiled and started bouncing with excitement in her seat. Ho'ola'i laughed as she started driving towards the nearest ice cream shop, convinced that her daughter would feel better in a few days. But after a week, Jade was not feeling any better. Her head still hurt and she could barely see out of her left eye, so her mom called the optometrist, who told her it was time for them to go see a doctor who has a specialty in these types of issues. The next morning, Jade's mom sat beside her dad, Jack, in the eye specialist's office. Jade curled up on her father's lap, playing a game on his phone while they waited for test results and x-rays. A moment later, a stout man in a lab coat walked into the office and sat on a stool opposite Jade and her parents. He pulled the stool closer to his desk, pulling Jade's x-rays up on his computer screen and flipping through a clipboard on his desk. He told Jade's parents that the antibiotics had not cleared up the black mass on Jade's eye. Then he pointed to the dark spot on Jade's x-ray. The doctor explained that the mass behind Jade's eye appeared to be inflamed, and when he compared the x-ray taken that morning to the x-ray taken last week, the mass really seemed to be growing bigger, which meant that Jade's sight loss would likely only get worse. Her headaches might become more severe too, and if the mass got too swollen, Jade could lose all sight in that eye. Jade's mom suddenly felt a lump in her throat as she asked the doctor what could be done. The doctor looked over at Jade with a hint of pity on his face, and then he said that he'd like to try injecting steroids directly into the mass, which would hopefully reduce the swelling and clear up the mass completely. It was a scary sounding procedure, he said, but it would be done with anesthesia and it would only take a minute. And once it was over, Jade really should be cured. Jade would have this procedure done, but 2 days later, when Jade and her mother, Ho'ola'i, returned for a follow-up appointment, the specialist walked into the examination room with a glum expression on his face, and he told them that the injection had not worked, and worse than that, he said he was out of ideas. They were going to have to find a new doctor. And so over the next few weeks, Jade and her mother visited 3 other eye specialists, but none of them could figure out what was causing this black mass on Jade's left eye either. Jade's mother was really frustrated and very upset. She remembered what the first specialist had said about her daughter potentially losing all the sight in her eye, and so now she felt like if they didn't find an answer soon, it would just be too late. By the time Jade and her mother found themselves waiting anxiously in the exam room of the most experienced eye doctors on the island, it had been almost 3 months since Jade's eye began to hurt, and both Jade and Ho'ola'i were fighting a growing feeling of hopelessness. Jade's mom would never give up on her daughter, but she was tired and scared. The door finally opened, and a tall man with short black hair and a prominent chin strode inside. His name was Dr. Eugene Ng, and he was a retina surgeon. He squatted down in front of Jade and asked her gently if he could look at her eyes. Jade smiled and nodded and let go of her mother's hand. Her mother felt relief rise in her chest. She liked Dr. Ng immediately, and it was clear Jade did too. But as Dr. Ng shined a flashlight into Jade's eyes and conducted a few quick tests, Jade's mother tried to tamp down her optimism. This was the same thing every other doctor had done, and when Dr. Ng clicked off his flashlight and stood up, she braced herself to hear him say, "Well, there's nothing we can do. Go find another doctor." But, unlike all the other eye specialists, Dr. Ng said he was fairly certain he knew what was wrong with her eye. Jade's mother could barely believe this. She smiled and let herself hope, just for a second, that finally her daughter would get the help she needed. But then she realized that Dr. Ng was not smiling back at her. Instead, he looked almost grim as he told her that while he could diagnose Jade's problem, nobody in all of Hawaii had the expertise to actually fix it. Jade needed immediate medical attention that was not available on the islands, so she would have to be flown to the mainland of the United States as soon as possible. A week later, Jade sat with her mother in the back of an Uber that was driving them from the Los Angeles International Airport to their hotel. Jade watched the other cars on the highway blur past and noticed how beige and concrete everything looked in Southern California compared to the lush green of Hawaii. Jade was really missing her father. Jack had had to stay home in Hawaii to work, and he was also going to miss Jade's birthday, which was in 2 days. Jade dreaded the idea of turning 10 without her father around, and she also dreaded seeing another specialist that afternoon. Even though her left eye was now completely blurry and her headaches had only been getting worse, Jade was scared of going to see another doctor. She was afraid that whatever treatment they would give her would be more painful and more uncomfortable than what she was already experiencing. But Jade tried to push her worry from her mind. After all, she was in the city where all her favorite movies were made. Her mom had even promised her that they could go do some sightseeing when they weren't at the doctor's office. And so Jade decided she was just going to have fun on this trip no matter what. That afternoon, Jade sat in another examination chair, this time at the Children's Retina Institute in Los Angeles. A doctor with red hair and a neatly trimmed beard was drawing blood samples from Jade's arm, while Jade told him all about the last time she'd been poked with a needle and how much it had hurt. The doctor's name was Dr. Khaled Tawanzi, and Jade's mother had told Jade that he was actually the one who started this institute. Jade watched the blood flow from her arm down through a plastic tube and into small vials. It didn't hurt at all, and Jade actually found it fascinating to watch. She asked Dr. Tawanzi what he was going to do with her blood, and he smiled at her. He explained that he'd send her blood to a very special laboratory where scientists would run all kinds of tests. Then, in a day or two, they'd know for sure if Dr. Ng was right about what was causing the blindness in her left eye. Jade imagined an all-white laboratory full of shiny machines and scientists in blue scrubs. She'd seen something like that in a movie once. It made her feel safe, like the best doctors in Los Angeles would be working to save her vision. Dr. Tawanzi told Jade that in the meantime, her very important assignment was to have as much fun in Los Angeles as possible. Jade smiled as her mom assured him that they had plenty of plans for that. 2 days later, Jade peered over the side of a tour trolley, watching a shark's fin move through a man-made pool set to the iconic Jaws movie soundtrack. It was her 10th birthday, and her mother had taken her to Universal Studios Hollywood. Just as the music reached a crescendo, an animatronic shark came leaping out of the water. Jade leaped back from the edge of the trolley, and then she laughed and clapped with the rest of the tour group. By the time Jade and her mother got off the trolley a few minutes later, Jade felt better than she had in a long time. For just a moment, she had forgotten all about her troubles. She decided it was birthday magic. As she led her mother away from the studios tour, Jade heard her mother's cell phone ring. She turned to look at her mom, and Ho'ola'i dug through her purse, pulled out her phone. She looked at the caller ID and asked Jade to wait a minute. It was Dr. Tawanzi calling. Jade sat down on a nearby green plastic bench while her mom paced and listened. Jade watched as the smile on her mother's face faded. Jade's stomach lurched. She knew that whatever news her mother was receiving, it could not be good. Jade swung her legs nervously as her mother hung up with the doctor and then made a second phone call, which was much shorter. And when her mother turned around, Jade could tell she was extremely upset. Ho'ola'i strode over and sat on the bench next to her daughter. Jade held her breath as her mom explained what the doctor had told her. Jade needed surgery. Jade felt tears well up in her eyes as she asked her mother if the surgery would actually save her eyesight. Her mom frowned and struggled to find the right words. Finally, she explained that they didn't know if this procedure could actually save her eyesight. But without this surgery, it was fairly likely that she could lose her entire left eye. If that happened, she would have to have a glass eye instead. Jade tried to picture the doctor cutting out her eye and what it would feel like with a glass ball in her eye socket. The very thought of it sent tears running down her face, and she turned to her mom and sobbed into her chest. The next morning, Jade's mother stood next to Jade's gurney at the Children's Retina Institute. Jade looked frightened and kept looking around for her father, who had gotten on the first plane available to come join them. Jack was supposed to have landed more than an hour ago, and Jade's mother was worried he would miss the surgery. Ho'ola'i squeezed her daughter's hand as Dr. Tawanzi propped open the double doors that led to the operating room. He asked Jade if she was ready, and her mother beamed proudly as Jade nodded her head bravely. Then they heard a commotion down the hall. They all turned to see Jade's dad, Jack, burst into the hallway and run toward the gurney. When Jack reached them, he leaned down and planted a big kiss on Jade's forehead. He whispered in Jade's ear happy birthday and that he loved her. Finally, a nurse said it was time to take Jade into surgery, and so Ho'ola'i and Jack both blew kisses at their daughter as she was rolled into the operating room. The parents held each other as they watched the doors swing closed. It all felt so unfair. Their daughter was barely 10 years old, and she might lose her eye. And now all they could do was wait and hope. In the operating room, Dr. Tawanzi waited until Jade was completely asleep before using a speculum, which is like a small vice grip, to pry open her left eyelid. Once her eyelid was propped open, Dr. Tawanzi began the careful process of removing Jade's eye completely from its socket so that only the optical nerve was connecting it to her body. Once Dr. Tawanzi had freed Jade's eyeball from its socket, he held it up and turned it around until he was looking at the back. He had seen scans of the mass on Jade's eye, but he was still shocked by how it looked in person. It was a thick, dark mass, and it was caked on so hard it felt like a rock. Dr. Tawanzi could tell it was going to be extremely difficult to remove it without permanently injuring Jade's eye, because the doctor knew there was a risk that this mass was not just on Jade's eye, it might be embedded inside of Jade's eye. And if that was the case, Jade would very likely lose her eye entirely no matter what Dr. Tawanzi did. But Dr. Tawanzi would not know how bad this was until he attempted to remove it. It took Dr. Tawanzi nearly 3 hours to remove this foreign mass from Jade's eyeball, slowly pulling it off one tiny piece at a time. It almost felt like he was tearing cardboard with each pull. But finally, with one last gentle pull, the last of the black lump dislodged. Dr. Tawanzi placed it all on a dish, and a nurse whisked it away for testing. Then he lifted Jade's eyeball with his forceps and slid it back into the socket, hoping it could be saved. The first thing Jade saw when she woke up was her parents' smiling faces. However, she only saw them through her right eye. A protective patch was covering her left eye following the surgery. Jade felt groggy, but she was so relieved to see her parents, especially her dad, who told her she looked so cool, like a pirate. But then Jade began to panic as she touched her patch and wondered if she still even had an eye behind it. Was there a glass eyeball now? But her mom took Jade's hand and told her, don't worry, she still had her eye. Dr. Tawanzi was able to save it. Jade smiled huge with relief. Her mom was crying and told Jade what a great job she did. A few moments after that, Dr. Tawanzi walked into the recovery room. Jade and her family grinned and thanked him for his help. But Dr. Tawanzi said they were not out of the woods yet. He told Jade and her parents that Dr. Ng had been right about his diagnosis. Jade's condition was much more dangerous than anything doctors in Hawaii could treat, and the surgery was not a guaranteed solution. Because Jade's eyeball had been invaded by living creatures. The creatures, he said, were parasites called Toxocara, otherwise known as roundworm. Dr. Tawanzi explained that usually Toxocara is spread through dog feces. He asked if Jade had a pet dog at home. Jade said no, but then she told Dr. Tawanzi about the stray dog that she sometimes played with at the local park. Dr. Tawanzi nodded and said that it was very possible to pick up Toxocara at a park frequented by stray dogs, or even just by pets and their owners. All it would take for Jade to get this infection would be for her to touch a tiny bit of dirt with dog feces on it, and then touch her mouth. Toxocara is not rare. In fact, they are one of the most common parasites in the world. About 5% of American adults have antibodies in them that show they have been exposed at some point in their lives to Toxocara. But most people who ingest Toxocara eggs don't get a single symptom and never even know the parasite was inside of them at all. Typically, the body forms a hard shell around the parasite and expels through the intestines. But in some cases, the body is too slow to react, and the parasites migrate through the body and end up in organs like the liver, kidneys, and sometimes even the eyes. And that's what had happened to Jade. She had developed a very rare condition called ocular toxocariasis. In ocular toxocariasis, the body does finally form that protective shell around the parasites, but only after the parasites have attached themselves to the eye. That's why the mass on the back of Jade's eye was so hard. Her body was trying to protect her, just a little too late. Jade got lucky. Her body's response had come in time to stop the parasites before they completely destroyed her eye. And Dr. Tawanzi was pretty sure he managed to remove every last parasite from her body. Still, he told Jade and her parents that she would have to be watched very closely in the days ahead to make sure he had not missed any. Most of Dr. Tawanzi's explanation went way over Jade's head, but she grimaced at the disgusting thought of accidentally eating dog poop, and Dr. Tawanzi actually laughed a little bit when he saw Jade's face. He told her it's much more common than you think. Just make sure you always wash your hands after the playground and you'll be okay. Jade grinned as a wave of relief washed over her. She was ready to be done with doctor's offices and dog poop. A few days later, the family all flew back home to Hawaii. Jade's eyesight in her left eye would come back. However, it really never fully recovered. But other than her vision, she would be okay. Jade would go on to be a cheerleader for her high school, and she would also continue to dance hula.
In the summer of 2015, a young man named Paul was on his last day of a 7-day solo backpacking trip through a very remote area in Utah called the Dark Canyon Wilderness. Dark Canyon gets its name from its steep walls that block light in the morning and in the late afternoon. It's an area that's only accessible by foot, and it's not uncommon to go in there and not see another person the whole time you're there. That morning, Paul got up and set off on a day hike that would take him through a very forested area up onto a plateau where he planned to camp out for the night. About a mile into the hike, he found some amazing elk antlers and he decided he wanted to keep them. So he threw them on his backpack and rested them at the top and continued on his hike. But the added 15 pounds of weight proved to be far more exhausting than he was anticipating, and very quickly he blew through all of his water. Even though he was within 1 mile of his final destination, this plateau, he decided to stop because he was so dehydrated, he needed to find water. So he puts his pack down, he puts the elk antlers down, and he starts walking around, and amazingly, he does find some water. Granted, it was kind of a gross puddle of standing water, but he figured I can boil this and it should be okay. And as he's preparing a fire to boil this standing water, he figures, you know what, if I'm making a fire here, I might as well just make my camp here. So he sets up his tent and then he makes a fire and he's about to start boiling this water when he realizes how dumb he's being. If there's a puddle of standing water right here, then probably just a little ways upstream, there's going to be some running water. Why don't I not boil this crappy water that will only yield, a couple sips of water and go look for the running water where I can drink as much as I want? So he puts the pot down and he leaves all of his gear at the campsite and he begins walking up this mountain to hopefully find a stream. And after about a half mile of walking up this mountain, he finds this little spring. Immediately, he's down on hands and knees drinking as much water as he possibly can because he's super dehydrated. And after he's drank for quite a while, he reaches down to his belt where he kept his water bottles. And he realized he left all of his gear, including his water bottles, at camp. So he didn't have a way to collect this water. And so he's like, shoot, I gotta go back to camp and get the bottle and come back. I'm gonna burn a bunch of energy. But he's like, you know what can you do? I need the water. And so he gets up and he turns around and he starts walking back towards his camp. And immediately he starts to feel really anxious as he's walking back. he can't help but feel like someone's behind him watching him. And he kept turning his head, thinking he's going to see someone just over the mountain who's quietly stalking him, and he just could not shake this feeling. And so as he's walking back to camp, every little sound he hears is totally throwing him off. Every little rustling leaf, every little bird overhead, he's totally on edge because he's convinced someone is behind me or someone's over there, someone's watching me. He finally gets back to camp, he gets his water bottles, and he considered not going back to the spring because he didn't want to cover that distance again because of how stressful it just was. But ultimately, he knows he needs the water. So either he's going to sit here for a really long time and boil a bunch of stagnant water, or he can just suck it up, walk to the spring, get some water, come back, and be good. Before he walks up to the spring, he grabs a really big stick to use as a club, and then he walks up. So now he's got some protection. And immediately, as he begins that half-mile trek to the spring, the anxiety pours right back over him, and he can't help but feel like someone is watching him. But he gets up to the spring, he fills his water bottles, he turns around, and he starts walking back, and he walks down this little rock face and lands on the trail he had just been on a minute ago, and he stops because he sees something on the ground that wasn't there before. A fresh mountain lion print is placed right in between two of his footprints that he had just made on his way back to the spring. Meaning, there's a mountain lion somewhere right around here that's not just watching me, it's hunting me. Paul doesn't really know what to do, so he runs to his campsite and gets in his tent and huddles in his tent for the rest of the night, hoping a mountain lion doesn't attack him. And fortunately, it does not. And what he thinks probably happened was when he picked up those elk antlers and put them on his backpack and was walking around with them, he probably attracted the mountain lion that thought he was an elk and therefore food.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Rattlesnake Canyon. At about 1:30 in the afternoon on August 8th, 1999, a park ranger named Lance Madsen stood frowning down at a dusty red Mazda car inside of an otherwise empty parking lot just outside of Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico. Lance knew the two men who owned this red Mazda had taken out a one-night permit to be allowed to go into Rattlesnake Canyon, which is one of the most isolated parts of this national park. It's basically just a single long, scrubby little trail that's kind of all desert with high canyon walls on either side. In order to get access to Rattlesnake Canyon, people need to go to the visitor center and literally fill out paperwork so the park rangers know they're out there and can go out and check on them if they don't come back in time. And so the two men who owned the Mazda had done that. They had filled out all the paperwork, but now Lance was noticing they had not returned at the end of their permit. They had stayed out, presumably in Rattlesnake Canyon, for an additional 3 nights. Now, Lance was not concerned because people did do this. It was more like he was annoyed because now he would have to go out into Rattlesnake Canyon and find these two guys and figure out what was going on. So Lance and the park volunteer that he was with began walking on the trail in the direction of Rattlesnake Canyon. And after walking less than a mile on this trail, Lance and this volunteer looked up ahead, and just off the trail, there was a green and maroon tent that was pitched right out in the open. And so Lance immediately assumed that this had to be the two men who owned the red Mazda. And so very quickly, Lance's annoyance was replaced with relief because it turned out it was really easy to find these two campers, and he'd be able to go figure out what was going on and either get them back to their car and get them to leave, or if they wanted to, they could, in theory, extend and stay longer with the right permitting. But when Lance and his partner walked down the trail and left the trail to go walk over to this tent, they started to notice there was something off about it. Right away, as they got closer and closer to this tent, they began to smell this horrible kind of chemical burning smell, and then also all over the ground were all these little bits of burned pieces of trash. And then finally, when Lance and his partner actually arrived right in front of the tent, and they were looking down at the closed flap, it was zipped shut, they saw clearly there was something moving around inside of the tent. But whoever or whatever it was wasn't making any noise, and so Lance and his partner, they kind of looked at each other, and they both at this point were pretty nervous. You know, their hearts are racing, they don't know what's going on here, and then Lance just kind of impulsively reached down, unzipped the tent, and lifted it open.
And when he saw what was inside, he immediately was hit with this wave of fear and anxiety. Three days earlier, on August 5th, 1999, a 26-year-old man named David Coughlin woke up in a sleeping bag inside of his green and maroon tent in Rattlesnake Canyon. And as soon as David sat up, he smiled because he could hear right outside of his tent the sound of his best friend, Rafi Kodakian, making breakfast and gathering up supplies for that morning's hike. Dave and Rafi were on what they called a trip of a lifetime. 6 days earlier, they had left their hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, and traveled more than 2,000 miles west, sleeping at campsites and cheap motels along the way. Their final destination was a university in Santa Barbara, California, where Dave was going to be getting his master's in environmental engineering, but they were going to basically turn the journey out to California into a big vacation. And Carlsbad Caverns National Park was easily both of the men's favorite spots so far, because unlike the other campgrounds they had stayed at so far, which were kind of cheap and small, Carlsbad Caverns was huge. It was 47,000 acres of just wild desert. And so for Dave and Rafi, whose normal everyday lives were kind of safe and boring, doing desk jobs and the like, this felt sort of thrilling, like they were cowboys exploring the Wild West. As Dave sat inside of his tent, listening to Rafi make breakfast and get ready, Dave noticed he was already sweating, despite it being pretty early in the morning. It was just already so hot outside. And so Dave grabbed his water and took a sip, and as he did, he thought about that park ranger who had helped them fill out their paperwork to be allowed to come out into Rattlesnake Canyon, who had made a really big deal about ensuring that Dave and Rafi each have at least 1 gallon of water per person per day that they were going to be out here because of the heat. But after they had left the park ranger, Rafi, who had way more experience camping than Dave did, explained to Dave that that was totally overkill and they didn't need that much water. So instead of bringing 2 huge gallons of water for the single night they planned to be out in Rattlesnake Canyon, Rafi had brought along for both of them just 3 16-ounce bottles of water. For reference, that's approximately 6 times less than what the park ranger had suggested. The men had already used one of those 16-ounce bottles of water to boil hot dogs the night before for their dinner, and now the bottle that Dave was drinking from was already half empty, and so he was pretty much down to the last of his water. But Dave wasn't really worried about his water because he and Rafi were going to be hiking out of Rattlesnake Canyon that day and heading back to their car and continuing their journey out to California. And they knew they had set up their tent very close to the parking lot. And so it was a short hike. They're back in their car and then they're good. And so Dave capped his water, he got out of his sleeping bag, he left the tent, and he joined Rafi in prepping their supplies to get ready for their hike out. And by 8:30 a.m., their entire site was packed up and the 2 men were on their way heading back. The 2 men walked at a leisurely pace in the direction towards their vehicle for about an hour, and as they walked, they did see signs that they were on the right trail. There were these stacks of white rocks that marked the trail, but after walking this full hour, they knew they probably should have been at the parking lot, but they didn't see it yet. However, the 2 men were not worried yet because remember, they know they're close, and so they're thinking, okay, maybe a couple more minutes and we'll see the parking lot. And so they stopped, they had some more water, and then they kept on walking. But after walking for another 2-3 hours still in the direction that they believe was towards the parking lot, they did not see the parking lot. In fact, they didn't see anything that looked familiar, and there were no more stacks of white rocks to show they were even on a trail. They were totally lost. And so Dave and Rafi, who were doing their best not to panic, they both sat down, they pulled off their packs, and they pulled out their topographical map and began looking for some sign of where they were. But neither man could read the topographical map, and so all the swirls on the map showing every contour of every geographical feature, it just didn't make any sense to them, and so the map was of no use, and it was getting hotter and hotter by the minute, and so Dave and Rafi put the map away feeling totally frustrated, and for a second they thought about getting up and just continuing to walk roughly in the direction they thought they should go, But as soon as they stood up, they both just felt so exhausted from walking and the heat, which was now, it's noon, so it's really burning down on them. And so the two men just walked over to the edge of a canyon wall where some shrubs were kind of hanging off the wall, providing a little bit of shade. And the two men just plunked down right underneath the shade, and they just sat there in silence. Both men knew they did not have the supplies to stay out in this canyon for much longer. They certainly didn't have enough water, which now really was starting to feel like a huge oversight. But luckily, as they're just sitting there, these huge storm clouds rolled in, and for a very short amount of time, there was this incredible downpour of rain. And so Dave and Raffi began catching the raindrops in their mouths, and they began drinking the water off of rocks and leaves. And it wasn't a lot, but it was enough to kind of boost their spirits. They got a little bit more hydration in, and they were kind of ready to deal with the problem they were facing. After the storm had gone, Dave and Raffi decided that their best move was just to continue walking and try to find this parking lot. But despite this motivation, Dave and Raffi would walk for hours and hours into the night. They would not find the parking lot, and so finally they realized they would have to stop and set up camp for another night. And so Dave and Raffi, who by now were really starting to feel scared, they found this washed out gully and they set up their green and maroon tent, but neither man could sleep. And so they just sat outside of their tent, telling each other that don't worry, the park rangers are bound to have noticed that we did not come back in time. We only had that 1-day permit. We've exceeded the limit. They're bound to come out here and find us. But in the back of both Dave and Raffi's mind, they weren't so sure that was definitely going to happen. They didn't really know how long it would take for park rangers to notice when people stayed too long. But as Dave and Raffi were speaking, they suddenly noticed far off in the distance something that looked like headlights, like on a car. And it was moving across the horizon. And both Dave and Raffi thought, wait a minute, that's got to be a road right there. All we have to do is go to that road and we're saved. We don't need the park rangers to come rescue us. And so suddenly Dave and Raffi were filled with hope, and they forgot about how thirsty and hungry they were, and they just crawled into their beds and they fell asleep almost immediately because all they wanted to do was get to the next morning where there'd be daylight so they could hike out and get to that road and get back home. Dave and Raffi woke up early the next morning, and they were very eager to get up and start making their way towards this road. But instead of packing up their campsite and bringing it with them, they decided instead to leave their campsite and leave behind a journal that had some information about who they were and what they were doing in case park rangers came looking for them. And so Dave pulled out a journal from his pack and he drew a kind of crude map of where this campsite was and where they were going towards this road that appeared to be up on this ridge. And then also Dave included in this note, Dave and Raffi's names, their ages, where they lived, some contact info, and also the fact that they were completely out of food and water, and that if you find this journal, please follow up and make sure we're okay. And so after leaving behind this journal at the campsite, Dave and Raffi set off to go to this road. But after walking for hours and hours up a kind of gradual incline, they reached what appeared to be this kind of third ridge where up and above the ridge was this road. But to get up onto this kind of wall right in front of them was really challenging. There was cactus everywhere, and the gullies that kind of led up to the top of this ridge were very slippery and almost vertical, so nearly impossible to climb. And so this was really a chore getting up there. And you got to remember that Dave and Raffi are already totally exhausted. They have no food, no water, and so this is miserable. But eventually, Dave and Raffi were able to get up onto this ridge, and they looked out, and there was no road. There was nothing. It was just pure desert as far as they could see. And so they had no idea what those lights were that they saw. Clearly, it was not headlights. For all they knew, it could have been a figment of their imagination. They're desperate to be saved, and so maybe it was possible that they imagined seeing this road. And so as the two men stared in stunned silence at nothingness in front of them, they noticed that a buzzard had actually begun flying in slow circles over their head, almost like it was just waiting for the two men to die so the buzzard could come down and eat them. Now, Dave was ready right then and there to head back to their campsite and just wait, but Raffi was insistent that they just keep on going because you never know, maybe there is a road just a little bit farther along. But after walking for maybe a couple more hours, they did not see a road, and by this point both men were beyond exhausted, and so the two men did finally turn around and painstakingly walk their way all the way back to their campsite. And as they're walking, they're telling themselves, maybe we'll get there and park rangers will be waiting for us. A search party will be here. But when they got to their campsite, there was absolutely no sign that anybody had come to their campsite since they left. Their journal with their note and their crude map and all that was still just sitting right in the middle of their campsite, untouched. And it was at this point that Dave and Raffi's spirits were just totally broken. The next morning was Saturday, August 7th. So Dave and Raffi were now beginning their 4th day in the desert and their 3rd day without any water. Raffi had gotten really sick from drinking his own urine, and Dave had begun to experience all these horrible stomach cramps, very likely from eating unripe prickly pears. Also, Dave's legs were starting to seize up, which made it nearly impossible to walk. And so the two men knew they had no chance of hiking out of here to safety. They really just had to wait for their rescue to come. And so that day, Dave and Raffi attempted, with the little energy they had, to make a huge SOS symbol on the ground using rocks. But after putting the S down and the O down, they didn't have enough energy to collect more rocks to make the last S. And so they did not finish their SOS symbol. And then also Raffi at some point soaked his sleeping bag in fuel and lit it on fire to try to create a smoke signal that somebody might see. But the smoke didn't get high enough, and so it didn't work. And so all that really accomplished was it destroyed Raffi's sleeping bag and also created this terrible stench around their campsite of burning chemicals from having burned the polyester material that made up the sleeping bag. And so by that afternoon, when the sun was right over their head and beating down on them, Dave and Raffi just crawled inside of their tent and laid there in silence. And as they did, they noticed the stones underneath their tent felt kind of cool, and so they cut the bottom of the tent out and just laid directly on these loose rocks inside of their tent. By that evening, when still no rescuers had arrived, Dave and Raffi really began to realize that this could be the end. And so Dave, he grabbed that notebook where they had drawn that crude map of where the lights and the road had been, and he flipped the page, and then he wrote a note to his girlfriend, basically saying goodbye, because he knew he was probably going to die. And then Raffi, he took the journal, and he did something similar, but also included that, he would not allow the buzzards to get them, that they would at least ensure their bodies were intact for their families to find. And then after writing these notes and tucking the journal away, Dave and Raffi crawled out of the tent because by now it's dark out, the sun's not out, it's a little bit cooler outside. And the two men, they sat down and they began having a fairly matter-of-fact conversation about the situation they were in. Both men were very emotional. At one point, Dave began screaming and crying just out of despair. But at the end of this conversation, the two men made a decision, an unthinkable one, that really would only ever be made in a situation like this. And so after both men were on the same page, they crawled inside the tent and zipped it up. It was the next morning, August 8th, 1999, when that park ranger and his volunteer that was with him had walked along the trail towards Rattlesnake Canyon and discovered Dave and Raffi's ransacked campsite. And they had walked up and they had seen all the burned materials nearby, which was Raffi's sleeping bag and other bits of trash they had tried to burn. And then they had gone to the front of the tent and Lance had opened it up. And when he looked inside, he saw Raffi, who was alive. He was laying on his side and he was only wearing these filthy green shorts. And he just looked totally emaciated and terrible and haggard. I mean, the guy really looked like he was on death's door. Then Raffi, when he saw Lance looking in, he just said, "Please tell me you have some water." And Lance did have some water. He gave it to him. And then Lance, knowing that Raffi was with another person, Dave, he said, "Hey, where is the guy you were with?" And Raffi, as he's drinking the water, just kind of casually pointed out of the tent somewhere off behind where Lance and his partner was. And so Lance and his partner, they turned around and they didn't see anybody. They were just kind of looking off towards the canyon wall and there was nothing there. And so Lance turned around again and he said, "Are you sure he's over there?" And Raffi, without any expression on his face, just continued to point and said, "Yes, he's right over there." And so Lance, he got up, he turned around, and he began walking towards this canyon wall. But before he got there, he nearly tripped over this arrangement of rocks on the ground. And when he looked down at them, he knew someone clearly had arranged these rocks in a particular way. And so, with a growing sense of dread, Lance reached down and he moved aside one of these rocks. And underneath it, he saw Dave's face. It would turn out, the night before, when Raffi and Dave had crawled outside of their tent and began having that very intense conversation, what they were talking about is, what do? We know we're going to die. No one's going to reach us before we die of starvation, or we die of dehydration, or maybe some animal is going to come attack us and kill us. Like, we don't have any hope. And so as they were sitting there, Dave actually pulled out his pocket knife and attempted to cut his wrists, but he couldn't cut deep enough to actually kill himself. And so Dave said to Raffi, "You're going to have to kill me. And then after that, you're going to have to kill yourself." And Raffi had agreed. And so Raffi and Dave, they went back inside their tent with no floor. It's just open rocks in the bottom. And Dave, he lied down on his back and he pulled his shirt up and he exposed his rib cage. And then Raffi, he pulled out his 4-inch pocket knife and he placed it right up against Dave's rib cage. And then with Dave basically egging him on to stab him, Raffi attempted to push the knife into his heart, but he couldn't break the skin. And so Dave, he's now screaming out in pain, but he's still urging Raffi to come on, just do it already. And finally, Raffi does manage to get the knife right through his ribs and into Dave's heart. Dave did not die right away, but Raffi covered his mouth and continued to push that knife in until he did die. And then once Dave was dead, Raffi used the little bit of energy he had to drag his body away from the tent, where he buried him under those rocks. And then Raffi, who now has no energy left, just crawled back to his tent and laid down on those loose rocks inside of his tent and waited to die. But just a few hours later, on the morning of August 8th, Lance the park ranger, along with his volunteer, had come down and discovered Raffi before he had died. Little did Dave and Raffi know, this campsite where they had been for the past few days was just a 15 or 20-minute walk from their car. 9 months later, on May 11th, 2000, Raffi pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. However, Raffi insisted throughout the trial that the reason he killed Dave was because Dave asked him to. It effectively was a mercy killing, and that Raffi intended afterwards to die himself. This was murder-suicide. And Dave's family believed Raffi, and so did another judge. And so ultimately, Raffi would only serve 16 months in prison before he would be released.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it.